Harvard Divinity School.
Paranthropology, the Anthropology of the Paranormal, March 23rd, 2022.
Good afternoon and welcome to our Nosologies event. My name is Giovanna Parmigiani and I'm the host of this series organized within the Transcendence and Transformation Initiative at the CSWR here at Harvard Divinity School. This series focuses on ways of knowing that are often labeled as non-rational, traditionally referred to as gnosis in Western philosophical and religious traditions, and often understood in contraposition to science. These ways of knowing are becoming more and more influential in contemporary societies, popular culture, and academic research. What is the place of spirit possession, divination, mediumships, and experiences perceived out of the ordinary in our lives? How can we study and approach this type of phenomena? Going beyond dichotomies such as body and mind, ordinary and extraordinary, reason and experience, and matter and spirit. This series hosts scholars of different disciplines and practitioners interested in exploring and expanding the boundaries of what counts as knowledge today. So it is with immense pleasure that I introduce today's guest, Dr. Jack Hunter. Jack Hunter is an anthropologist, like me, exploring the borderlands of consciousness, religion, ecology, and the paranormal. He is an honorary research fellow with the Alistair Hardy Religious Experience Research Center and a tutor with the Sophia Center for the Study of Cosmology and Culture, University of Wales, Trinity St. David, where he's lead tutor on the MA in Ecology and Spirituality and teaches on the MA in Cultural Astronomy and Astrology. He's also a lecturer on the Aleph Trust and Science in Consciousness, Spirituality, and Transpersonal Psychology. He's a research fellow with the Parapsychology Foundation and a professional member of the Parapsychological Association. In 2010, he founded Paranthropology, Journal of Anthropological Approaches to the Paranormal, and he's the author of Spirits, Gods and Magic, and Manifesting Spirits, and the editor of Mastering the Invisible, Greening the Paranormal, Damn Facts, and Talking with the Spirits. He lives in the hills of Mid Wales with his family, and his website can be found in the chat box now. Today, Dr. Hunter and I will have a conversation on what is the paranormal, how can we make sense of out of the ordinary experiences, and how can we study them anthropologically. So thank you, Dr. Hunter, for being with us today, and welcome virtually to HDS.
Thank you very much. It's lovely to be here. Great to be asked.
Thank you so much. So since the audience of Nosologies is both of academics and non-academics, let's start with terminology. I think it might be a good place to start. What is the paranormal? Is it natural? Is it supernatural? How do you prefer to call out of the ordinary experiences, and why?
Yeah, it's a good question. I like the term paranormal, and a lot of my research or my writing has been about kind of ways of rehabilitating the concept of the paranormal. Because if we look at the history of the term itself, and we go back to the origins of the Society for Psychical Research in the 1880s in London and Cambridge, it was these people like Frederick Myers, who came up with new terminology, specifically the term supernormal, to refer to things that previously had been talked about in terms of like miracles, as things that were in the domain of religion, for example. So from the very beginning of serious scientific research on paranormal things, the idea was to bring them out of the domain of sort of mysticism and religion and into the domain of the natural. So actually paranormal, supernormal are actually alternatives to supernatural. Yeah, so they're saying that actually this is normal. It's not, maybe it's not something that we experience all the time, but it's a normal part of the processes that go on in the world. So from that way of thinking, then of course the paranormal is perfectly natural. And it makes sense when we look at the data. Then people claim to have these experiences all over the world, all through time. So they seem to be normal and natural in that respect as well.
Fantastic. And may I ask you, how did you become interested in studying the paranormal?
Yeah, well, there's lots of different strands to my interest. One of them was always, I've been interested in religion for a long time. I wasn't brought up religious. I was brought up actually to be quite skeptical of religion, but it always fascinated me. And obviously within religion, there are all sorts of extraordinary things as well. So I was always drawn to the idea of things like miracles, or the idea of saints and relics and things like that. Where I have grown up here in mid Wales, there was a shrine up the road from where I live for Saint Malangell, and it was said that, you know, it had pieces of her body in there, and just the idea of that connection to me was fascinating. Then later, as I started to grow up, I had some extraordinary experiences of my own. One of the most significant ones for me was under the influence of magic mushrooms. The very first time that I had that experience, I saw what I described as kind of like fairies or small entities. They seemed to be two-dimensional, and they were in the grain of wood of a chest of drawers, and they kind of noticed me. They clocked me, they turned and looked at me, and then kind of carried on with their procession. And the interesting thing about this experience for me was that there seemed to be some kind of agency or intelligence behind this aspect of the experience. There was other things going on around it that were, more impersonal, kind of hallucinatory kind of experiences. But this particular experience seemed to be of something else, and it's kind of stuck with me through the years. And so when I got to university and started to study anthropology, I became increasingly interested in different ways of trying to think about, what are the nature of these kinds of experiences that from the mainstream perspective they must be delusional, or they have to be explained away in terms of psychopathology or whatever. But is there a way that we can look at these experiences without breaking them down, treating them seriously, kind of like on their own terms? And what happens then if you do that? What happens if you treat these experiences seriously? And it obviously leads off into lots of different areas. So I've ended up, becoming involved in parapsychology and religious studies and anthropology and all sorts of different areas to try and make sense of these experiences.
I see. Can you tell us what type of experiences you ended up studying the most, or participating into the most?
Yeah, well,
distinguish within the ethnographer and the person. I don't know. I personally sometimes think I cannot do that, but
Yeah, no. Well, my PhD research, which was the kind of culmination of all of this thinking at the time, was based around a group called the Bristol Spirit Lodge in Bristol. And they were a private home circle for the development of trance and physical mediumship. So there are people who would go into altered states of consciousness in a seance condition, with red lights, sitting in a cabinet with a circle of people around. And then the spirits would basically talk through their bodies. They become possessed. And this became my kind of main focus of research throughout my PhD. So mediumship is what I spent most of my time researching. And I started off, when I started early on, quite detached as an observer, not participating as much, mainly because of my own limitations of, being nervous about participating in this kind of thing and stuff like that. But eventually, as I got to know my group of informants, and I became more comfortable, then I moved also into more of a participatory kind of approach. Obviously, I was participating in the sense of attending seances with this group of people as well. But eventually, we reached the point where I also had my own taste of mediumship development for myself. And for me, this was the major point. This was actually I was still an undergraduate at the time, to be fair. I started this project when I did my undergraduate dissertation. It moved into my PhD. And for me, this experience that I had became what I call sort of an intersubjective entry point. It's not my term, I borrowed that term, but it's a nice term, because I shared an experience that my informants have also had, which gave me a kind of gateway into that world. Basically, what happened was there was an occasion when the medium couldn't attend, so they decided that they were going to do a group development sitting and basically invite spirits to make themselves known to anyone in the room. So I thought that, you know, I can meditate and just go with the flow and see what happens. I wasn't expecting anything to happen because things don't actually generally happen to me. But as I went into my meditation, I was listening to the kind of like the new age music, and, you know, the room was bathed in red light. I closed my eyes and I was sitting in a chair with my hands on the arms of the chair. And I started to feel a tingling in my left hand, that it almost started to feel as though my left hand was kind of being pushed up. It felt like it was being pushed upwards by a little balloon of air or something, puffing up like that. And which is a strange experience. And I also ended up having almost like a mini out-of-body experience during this moment, where it felt like I would just come out of the back of my body very slightly, so that I was slightly distanced from my physical body. And I could still feel my body. It was almost as though I was able to observe it and feel it at the same time. And my left hand started to literally move around. It was almost as if it was waving. And I was in a strange state of mind where I realized that, you know, I'm not consciously willing this movement. I don't know what it means. And it really freaked me out. And I snapped myself out of the mini trance. And I was my heart was going. I was like, what's going on? And then the people, you know, around me kind of laughed and made light of it. Because you should really expect something like that to happen if you go into these situations. So then I went into the meditation, and it all came on again, much more quickly, but it didn't progress any further. But for me, that experience, I call it my hand possession experience, was enough of a taster to realize that there is, at the very least, an experience that you can have. So there is an experiential origin to the belief in mediumship, at the very least, you know, that feels like your body is under the control of something else. And even though it was only my left hand, I can now imagine, you know, the whole experience, which also made me realize that it wasn't my calling to be a medium. I didn't want to do this. Although, you know, people had suggested that I could, if I wanted to, follow that path, but I didn't want to follow that path. So yeah, that was my point of intersubjective entry, a very important experience for me to show that there was, at the very least, an experiential side of mediumship that needed to be taken into consideration, not ignored. And then if you take that experience seriously in itself, then you have to take the other implications that go along with that as well, which may be that, you know, our standard models are limited, or they don't cover everything that happens in the world. So yeah, important experience.
Thank you for sharing this. And I'm smiling because as an ethnographer who works with contemporary pagans, I had my fair share of paranormal experiences as well. Yeah. And for us anthropologists who to a certain point went native, or could be, you know, accused to do so, we're not the only ones. There are, you know, Edith Turner and many others who did so and decided to tell this story. So thank you for sharing this. I'm with you. Thank you so much. But I have to ask you the question, because one of the traditional filters in order to understand mediumship is that, you know, with trickery, fraud, you know, performance. How in your study did you tackle with that in the light of your experience, but also of your being, you know, a scholar?
Yeah, well, it became actually quite a big focus of my dissertation in the end, thinking about the role of performance. And actually, complicating the idea of performance quite a lot. And I drew on the work of Richard Schechner, writing about, he talked about the efficacy entertainment braid in performances, and how you can have performances that are specifically geared towards affecting some kind of a change in the world, which would be like, you know, a magical ritual or a seance and things like that. Still a performance, but it's geared towards some kind of change. And then you've got the other end of the spectrum, which is a purely entertainment kind of spectacle. But he also talks about there being places in between pure entertainment and ritual, which also can be kind of potent kinds of performances. So it's really interesting in spiritualism, the relationship between mediumship and stage performances was always there right from the very beginning. You know, mediumship became a kind of like, well, a parlor activity, parlor game for people to have fun with. It went, you know, there were famous mediums who would go on tours around America and Europe, giving demonstrations in music halls and things like that. So there's always been this kind of, performative element to it as well. And you're right, the standard way of thinking is to say that, well, because there's a performative element to it, that therefore it's all fake. And it's also true that there was a lot of fakery, and there is a lot of fakery in these kinds of areas as well. So, but what I did was think about this issue of fakery and look in the cross-cultural context, and to think about the kind of the function of things like sleight of hand, deliberately manipulating people's perceptions in order to bring about, again, certain kinds of effects. We know from like stage hypnosis and things like that as well, that you can put people into trances and stuff by doing certain kinds of things. You can make people believe that magical things are possible by showing them, an illusion. There was a parapsychologist called Kenneth Batcheldor who did a study of psychokinesis, which is, mind matter effects. And his experiments were based around like spiritualist home circle kind of environments. And he found that one of his claims was that if he introduced fake phenomena, some kind of an artificial effect early on in these seances, that later on in the session, they would have much more kind of profound, genuine effects. And his suggestion was that, a trick or something like that can shift you into that state of belief in the moment that something is possible. And when you believe that something is possible, there's lots of experiments in parapsychology that suggest this. Famous one by Gertrude Schmeidler called the sheep-goat experiment, where people who are believers in psi score much higher in psi experiments. So Batcheldor suggested that tricks can induce this moment of instant belief. And he said it doesn't matter whether the person believes over the course of their lifetime that spirits exist or anything like that. What's actually important is in that moment that the experience is happening, whether they believe that it's happening or not. And then that can, feeds in. It suggests again that these phenomena are also, they're not just objective. We participate in them. Our own beliefs and perceptions are a part of those experiences too. So I kind of, made performance a bit more complicated by saying that even if I did detect trickery in these seances, and I think I did, with one of the physical mediums anyway, it doesn't necessarily mean that everything else that happens is fake, or that these are not actually techniques that have been employed by mediums and people, over hundreds of years, specifically geared towards inducing altered states in audiences. So that's how I dealt with it.
And so we can say that maybe trickery is a way, part of the technique in order to enable this type of phenomenon, right? Am I okay? Summarizing it correctly. I have a couple of questions from the audience. Sorry?
I was just saying it can be.
Okay, I think there's a little bit of a lag. So a bit of terminological explanations. You mentioned trance and physical mediumship. So can you tell us the difference? And also someone from the audience was asking about, is channeling a form of mediumship? And maybe, there's, lots of new age challenging, experiences and how you see them different or in line with what you studied.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Well, the difference between trance and physical mediumship, I should start off, there are many different kinds of mediumship, at least three, within the spiritualist tradition. So you have the more kind of psychic mediumship, which is what you might see in spiritualist churches, or in America, places like Lilydale, where they will have a medium who goes up on a platform, on a stage, kind of like in a church service kind of environment, and they'll pick up messages and they'll say, I'm getting a J coming through. Can anyone accept that name? And then someone will, and then they'll give them a reading and that kind of thing. So there's that kind of mediumship, which is very subjective. The medium is often interpreting symbols that they are having visions of in their minds. Then we've got trance mediumship, which is where in anthropology we would call it spirit possession, where the personality of the person is displaced by a spirit or a deity, or in the case of new age channeling, it could be extraterrestrial intelligences or cosmic minds or something like that. So yeah, I would think that channeling is a form of trance mediumship, where the person goes into an altered state of consciousness, and in that state they are taken over by a spirit. So that was the main practice in the Bristol Spirit Lodge. But then there is also physical mediumship. And in the 19th century, up until like maybe the 1930s, 1940s, physical mediumship was quite common. And it was the production of things like ectoplasm, which was a supposedly a semi-physical substance really that we contain within our bodies, but that can be exuded during seances and is manipulated by spirits. Physical mediums would also do things like produce like full physical manifestations of people, or maybe limbs or heads that would move around independently. Lots of strange stuff. Objects would move around, and kind of like poltergeist cases almost. Okay, so in the 1940s, I think one of the last famous physical mediums really was Helen Duncan. She was actually the last person tried for witchcraft in Britain during the Second World War. But after that, physical mediumship kind of had a bad reputation. People like Houdini had spent a long time exposing fraud, fraudulent mediumship and stuff. So physical mediumship in particular became kind of like blacklisted as a practice, and people didn't really want to develop it anymore or practice it until maybe the 1990s with a group called the Skoll Group, who really kind of reinvigorated that and brought it back. So the group that I worked with anyway, they did trance mediumship and physical mediumship. They were trying to produce ectoplasm, not very successfully, and they were trying to produce levitations of objects and things like that. But we would have visiting mediums who were more developed in physical mediumship, who would come. And the difference with these mediums was that you would pay as well when they came to visit, which entered into a whole different kind of territory. But the phenomena that these physical mediums were producing was much more objective. You couldn't deny that something was happening in the seance room. But the big question is, what's happening? And a lot of the time, like we were just talking about, it seemed to be, torches and tricks and things like that. But that's not to say, again, that because other people have had with the same medium all sorts of, amazing, mind-blowing experiences. So it's a very complicated area to disentangle.
No, I do understand. And what about New Age? Do you see, New Age channeling as a form, how is it different from other forms of channeling, for example, as the one anonymous attendee is asking?
Yeah, I think in many ways it's very similar to spiritualist trance mediumship. But I think with spiritualists, most of the time, the people who come through the medium's body claim to be, the spirits of the dead. human spirits, essentially. Whereas with New Age channeling, it's much broader, isn't it? The entities that come through, they may be spirits of the dead, but they also claim to be all manner of different things.
No, I understand. Thank you for a clarification. Are you still doing ethnography with mediumship, maybe over Zoom? I just attended, actually was invited to mediumship,
Yeah.
so a couple of weeks ago. It happened over Zoom and I found it interesting. Are you having this type of experiences as well?
My research has shifted its focus, really. And most of my research at the moment is about sort of more fairy experiences, encounters with extraordinary beings, like fairies. My sister had a fairy experience when we were young, and it kind of always really interested me. She saw a small man with red hair and a green outfit on, dancing on the shelf in my bedroom. It was a very strange experience. And obviously my own psychedelic experience was with fairies as well. So my research recently has been focused in my local area, and trying to discover what the state of contemporary fairy beliefs is around here. Because I found a lot of very interesting stuff historically, which I was not aware of, even though I've grown up here. And so all my experiences and my sister's experience occurred within this folkloric context that we weren't aware of. So this is where my research is going now.
Very, very good. I might ask you more about your current or future research later, but I would really like to know, how do you think we can study the paranormal anthropologically? Because of course, how paranthropology differs from the anthropology of religion, because it does, right? Can you tell us a bit, how you navigated this complex and interdisciplinary space in your academic experience?
Yeah. Well, I think one of the big benefits of anthropology as a discipline for thinking about these things, as distinct from maybe like psychology or physics or or parapsychology even, is that the emphasis is on the context, the situation that's going on, and all of the different factors that are in play in an ethnographic moment. So it's non-reductive, or at least it has the potential to be. And I think that's what we need to understand these kinds of complex experiences. The moment that we start to try and break them down and put them into a laboratory condition, remove them from the emotional lived world experience that they take place in naturally, then we're kind of steering ourselves away from understanding them. So it's very interesting, parapsychology is influenced by this idea in Western science that that's the way that we do research, that's the way that we find out what's true. Whereas anthropology is saying, actually, it's not about separating the phenomenon from the world. We actually have to understand it in the world. So I think that's where anthropology's main contribution lies. But obviously within anthropology, there are lots of different approaches as well. It's not one big field. And it is one big field, but it's not one big monolithic field. And there are lots of different interpretations. In for example, like physical anthropology, biological anthropology, all of that kind of stuff. All of this kind of talk about fairies and mediumship and things like that is totally out there and beyond anything. But then on the sort of more social end of things and cultural end of things, then we can start to entertain and explore, other people's worldviews. So the step then is to, my step anyway, is what I call ontological flooding. Anthropology allows us to study these things in their natural context, but then we have to take another step beyond, what the established models and things allow us to talk about. So, we can talk about quite happily in anthropology about spirit possession and all sorts of different kinds of weird, religious beliefs and all sorts of things, as long as we're talking about them in terms of social and cultural, constructs, essentially. It's all socially constructed. at the end of the day. And really the true ontology underlying all of this is, Western physics, which is the queen of it all. Okay, so that's where most of this research begins from. And that ontological flooding is then saying that, actually we need to take into consideration many, many different kinds of processes that might be going on. Yes, there is a physical world that physics can explain, but then there's also this experiential thing that's going on. Why is it that people have these kinds of strange experiences? Why are there patterns between these experiences, that seem to be disconnected from each other, and all of these kind of things. And to think about these experiences in terms of, their social contexts, cultural contexts, and also their ecological contexts, which is the other direction that my research has been going recently. So I think that's what anthropology really allows us to do. And it also allows us to participate in a way that maybe sociologists might shy away from, or other kinds of psychologists and things. So we're encouraged to actually, participate in rituals in order to understand them. It wasn't always the case, obviously. If you go back to E.B. Tyler and those kind of people, again, it would be anathema to actually go native. But after Edith Turner and all of that work, and the ontological turn as well, anthropology has got a lot of space for exploring all of these kinds of issues in a non-reductive way. Yeah.
Thank you so much. That was very useful. And I would say that maybe anthropology of religion, traditionally mainstream one, focuses more on, studying religious beliefs while bracketing the question about what is real and existent, right? And distinguishing the two layers, which is very important always. But it seems to me that paranthropology goes a step further in, doing that, but also accepting the possibility that something is really happening. Am I correct?
Yeah, definitely. Yes, bracketing has been one of my big bugbears. I used to think that bracketing was really excellent. And in a lot of ways it is, because like I was saying, it opens it up. You can talk about, beliefs, as long as you put the brackets around it, about the question of whether it's real or not. It's very liberating. And when I first started to do my research, I was like, oh, this is great. I can just put brackets up and everything will be fine. But then the moment that you start to, like for example, my own experience, where it sort of seems to confirm in some way the beliefs, then the brackets start to fall off, don't they? You have to then confront the issue of whether there is something more than just social facts, and whether there might actually be some kind of real thing going on with this, with mediumship, for instance. So yeah, breaking down those brackets is a good thing. That's where ontological flooding comes from, is the idea that the brackets kind of hold back all of this possible stuff, and that we can let those brackets fall in, and then all of these different ideas come flooding in, different ways of interpreting things, different ways of understanding them. Yeah.
And from ethnographer to ethnographer, from anthropologist to anthropologist, how you find your own balance between, taking possibility into consideration and still working with the parameters of academia. Anthropology, it's true, give us lots of flexibility and tools in order to explore, but still, I find, I'm curious to know about how you think about balancing these aspects.
I think one of the keys to being balanced about it is just to be reflexive and to acknowledge that, within all of this stuff, this is not, what I say is not the definitive statement, or what anyone says is not the definitive statement. We're contributing to an expanding field of knowledge. So we have to be kind of, humble about it, I think, is one way of dealing with that. Yeah. And
thank you so much. Yeah.
Acknowledging our own subjectivity and all of that kind of stuff, and just being transparent.
That's wonderful. I agree with you. Thank you for saying so beautifully. What do you think are the main challenges and, potential possibilities a paranthropology opens up? So how do you see the field going?
Yeah, I think an interesting direction the field is going to go in. But this applies to social sciences generally and anthropology as well, is, you know, decolonizing our ways of thinking about these things. I think that I've just been teaching, just not even an hour ago, teaching a seminar on indigenous research methods. And I think that indigenous research methods, because they begin from very different ontological assumptions to, you know, Western scientific research methods, have a whole load of interesting scope for exploring these kinds of experiences. You know, for understanding these experiences in terms of, you know, a relational cosmology, for example, rather than in terms of a cosmology of discrete entities who are separate from each other. So I think, yeah, the future is in exploring these new and also old approaches to doing research and to interpreting data.
That's very fascinating. And I would like to take the opportunity to ask you a couple of questions from the audience around intrusive power dynamics or cultural appropriation hierarchies in the study of paranthropology. Do you have something to add on this?
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously it's a big issue, isn't it? But, you know, as an anthropologist, we're not, you know, we're not appropriating other people's worlds or saying that they're ours or anything like that. We're kind of like, you know, describing, or however we want to think about it, translating it to other people. So I think, you know, it's just a matter of how we think about the work that we're doing, the way, the kinds of approaches that we bring to it. If we can avoid that tendency, then that's a good way to go.
No, thank you. I think an answer to this question requires, you know, at least an event of it on its own. And yeah. I want to assure the audience that all the questions will be forwarded, that you're asking will forward to Dr. Hunter. So if we don't have time to answer them here, they will reach him later. So as you know, I'm teaching now a course in religion, materiality and the senses, and in the anthropology of magic and religion. And I have lots of students interested in this type of phenomena. So what would be your advice for students interested in studying the paranormal? And also, if I can add a sort of question that I received yesterday by email from Sean from the California Institute for Human Science, where, you know, students can study this type of phenomenon.
Yeah, well, it's an interesting question. There's a lot, I've seen other people giving advice about this, because paranormal obviously is almost a taboo subject for a lot of people. So lots of scholars who are interested in these things suggest that you should save it until later on in your career. But I don't think that's good, necessarily good advice, because it's not how new fields emerge, is it? You don't save it up till later. If it's here and now and it's relevant, then we should be, you know, studying it now, whether we're students or anything. And it should be made possible for people to study it if that's what they're interested in. So my advice is that if you are interested in studying these things, then do it, but do it within within your discipline, using the tools that your discipline has got at its disposal. Because, you know, you can't argue with that. You know, if you use anthropological methods to study the paranormal in whatever way, then, you know, you're doing the anthropology of the paranormal. So I think, yeah, my advice is if you're interested in it, then go ahead and do it. You know, talk to your supervisors and things and explain why you're interested, why it's a valid field. There is a whole legitimate history, you know, scholarly history of anthropologists engaging with these things. So it's very easy to back it up with, you know, reputable sources. So yeah, all of these kinds of things are important.
Talking about reputable sources, we have a question from an anonymous attendee saying, what book recommendation on alternative research methods do you have? And also I would add to this, how do we study spirits, you know? Because sometimes I meet students who are interested in doing an anthropology of the spirits, right? And where they, present themselves allegedly, and how they navigate through cultures, for example. And I'm thinking of you, you, Rebecca, and yes, so.
Yeah, well, my go-to first port of call would be Edith Turner. She got a very useful, very short little paper published in 1993, I think, called The Reality of Spirits, a tabooed or permitted field of study. It's just a very short paper, but she explains some of the experience that she had in Zambia, engaged in this in a ritual. And if the next step then would be to go on to her book, I think, Experiencing Ritual, which is really, it lays it all out. It tells you how she participated in the ritual, how she let herself flow with the emotions and all of these kinds of things to allow something more than she was expecting to happen. And it culminated with her seeing essentially an ectoplasmic kind of materialization of a strange gray blob. But yeah, so I would direct people to Edith Turner's work for a participatory way of approaching the spirits. I think also, though, there needs to be a degree of caution when approaching the spirits, because if we think in terms of traditional worldviews and things, you should give offerings and all of these kind of, it's a reciprocal relationship with the spirits, and spirits are tricksy. So think carefully about doing research with spirits, because it can lead you down strange routes. Be respectful about it. And just because you can't necessarily see them in the field doesn't mean that you're not offending them in certain ways. You have to be careful. So that's another piece of advice that I would give if you do want to research spirits.
Very important one. Thank you so much. And talking about spaces within the current structure of academia that we can find in order to carve as a space to research this type of topics, let's talk about anthropology of consciousness. Of course, there's a Society of Anthropology of Consciousness within the AAA, the American how it's called, Anthropological Association. Yeah, can you tell us more about it? You're part of it, obviously, and yes, can you tell us more? Maybe also what anthropology of consciousness mean, and how it emerged as a field of study.
Yeah, well, it emerged from in the 1970s and 80s, really, from partially, in response to people like Carlos Castaneda, who had written his influential books about his meetings, ostensible meetings with the Yaqui sorcerer and all these kind of things, which really made the idea of being an anthropologist and going out into the field and exploring weird experiences popular for people. So it actually encouraged a lot of anthropologists to, even if Carlos Castaneda didn't actually do the things that he said he did, or he didn't do all of them maybe, other people did then go out and do that. And so organizations started to emerge. There was different forms that it took. It was called an Association for Transpersonal Anthropology for a while. And then eventually they decided on the Anthropology of Consciousness as a venue. There's a journal and conferences as well for anthropologists to talk about all of these different kinds of things, parapsychological experiences right at the very beginning. But as the years went by, and you can kind of tell with the name of the journal, Anthropology of Consciousness, that the focus emphasis drifted away quite a bit from, these kinds of extraordinary experiences that had initiated the field in the first place. And there was a great paper published a few years ago now by Mark Schroll called something like With a Sigh in Anthropology. And it was about why this whole process had taken place and why the anthropological interest in the paranormal had dwindled. But I think a part of the reason was for kind of in an attempt to kind of legitimize the study of these things, it kind of got watered down. So, there was much less emphasis on real extraordinary experiences, paranormal experiences, and much more of an emphasis on consciousness cross-culturally, which is very interesting in itself. But, it kind of moved away. And that's why I set up Paranthropology, because, it seemed as though the venue that had initially been set up to talk about the paranormal within anthropology had kind of lost that focus. So yeah, I set up a journal to reignite that discussion about the real strange kinds of experiences. We're not watering it down with the paranormal, actually, dealing with it face value as a very strange thing. Yeah.
No, thank you for this clarification. I think it was very useful to many of us. I would like to spend our last minutes to discuss some of your more recent work, greening the paranormal. So you wrote a book about it. We're all concerned about climate change, and many of us do follow sort of relational ontology that, what's the role of these, relational ontologies in environmentalist activism?
Yeah. Well, the book is it's a collection of essays from different scholars, different people in different fields, but it's all focusing around extraordinary experiences and ecology. And it might seem like these are two very, distinct kinds of things. Ecology is the science of, living systems essentially, and how they interact with each other and all of that kind of stuff. And extraordinary experiences, parapsychology is the study of, paranormal experiences. But there's a weird overlap between the two in lots of different ways, in fact. One of the ways is through people who engage with ecology, who participate in landscapes in all sorts of different ways, whether we're talking about like through walking or surfing or whatever. It's something that Bron Taylor talked about in his book, Dark Green Religion. People have extraordinary experiences that come directly from participation in ecology. One of the main forms of mystical experiences, if you look in the literature on mystical experiences, is extrovertive experiences, where the landscape and everything around you is transformed in some way, revealing, mystical connection with God or whatever. So, there's a long tradition of knowing, of awareness of this role of, nature and in extraordinary experiences. So there's that side of things, which was really interesting. And then there's another strand of it, which has emerged in recent years with, science of things like plant consciousness and plant memory and all this stuff, especially the work of Monica Gagliano and other colleagues, which is increasingly suggesting that the world is much more animate than we've given it credit for. And then, when we compare that with all the literature of the paranormal is basically saying the same thing, that the world is, occupied, that this world is haunted, that there are many different kinds of minds, non-human forms of consciousness that exist in the world around us that we can interact with in different ways. So, that was another of the strands of this idea of greening the paranormal. And then a third strand was that, actually, similar to, the idea of the greening of religion, is that the paranormal in America is a massive demographic, in terms of people's belief in spirits or ghost hunting groups and Bigfoot and all of these kinds of things, UFOs. So, people have made the case that religion provides a good demographic for getting people to think about ecology. But I think, the paranormal does as well. Millions of people around the world are interested in these topics. And if they realize that actually, in some ways, the paranormal is dependent on a healthy ecology, then people will, maybe change their mind, change their behaviors, and actually, do something regenerative. So I made the case of, Bigfoot hunters, for example, should be planting trees and restoring Bigfoot habitats when they go out on their excursions and things like that. So it could have very real positive effects. So yeah, there's lots of strands to that book, but yeah, it's a good
Thank
book.
you so much. And I think it's partially linked to a question from the audience. how does, Melissa, how does the sacredness of place have a role in your anthropological work? Do fairies actually have a place in America?
In America, they probably do, yeah. In my work, though, yeah, the sacredness of place is becoming increasingly central. My work is becoming increasingly focused on the valley that I live in. It's become, and the more that I research it, the more that I find out that, you know, historically, the people who've lived in this area have, you know, identified certain parts of the landscape as being occupied places. There are places that have got, supposedly have dragon nests in them, or vipers' nests. There are places where giants have created features of the landscape. They've left boulders behind, and they've knocked parts of mountains off. There are caves where miners in the 19th century claim to have had encounters with you know, an old hag living deep down in the mountains with a big brass pan, you know, stirring, washing up in there, crazy things. And stories of people in villages around here waking up in the night like my sister did and having encounters with beings that claim to be spirits of the air. So, you know, this whole place that I've been in, the more that I research it, the more that I think that actually, for our ancestors, definitely, but maybe something that we would need to rekindle in the people who live here now is a sense of how sacred and alive it actually is. So yes, it's an important aspect of my work at the moment, I think.
Thank you very much. I will, you know, spend the last maybe few minutes by asking questions from the audience. There are very many, so thank you so much for participating in this conversation. Damien asks, have you ever had an experience of a certain limit to your spiritual experiences when trying to look upon it by an academic perspective?
Well, I mean, my possessed hand experience could be considered a limit for some people. You know, that was at the point where I lost my objectivity. In a sense, it was, because I moved into my intersubjective place. Another experience that I had, which I should mention in the idea of intersubjectivity, it was actually the very, very first seance that I went to. And I saw what I later learned spiritualists called transfiguration, where a face of a spirit appears over the face of the medium. And in this very first seance that I attended, I saw this green mask appear over the face of the medium and kind of slide down and just sort of dissipate. And I thought that it was a subjective experience. You know, it was a hallucination of my own. But then when we went out into the house afterwards to discuss, you know, what had happened in the seance and to have tea and some biscuits and stuff like that, independently, I didn't mention it. I didn't want to mention it because it was my first ever seance. I didn't want to make it look like I was some kind of I'm having all these crazy experiences kind of person. But someone else said, "Did you see that face?" And I had no choice but to say, "Yeah, I did." But I thought that it was a hallucination. So again, it opens up this possibility that there are certain kinds of experiences that are subjective experiences, but that can be shared as well, or intersubjective experiences, that I think is super interesting.
Thank you. Anonymous attendee asks, in what ways are paranormal states similar to or different from other types of transcendence, for example, psychedelic transcendence?
Well, I think there are lots of similarities. The book I'm working on at the moment, which is very nearly finished, is called Deep Weird, The Varieties of High Strangeness Experience. And the real central theme of the book is that all of these different kinds of experiences are connected in some way. It's not to say that they are identical with each other, but that there are similar kinds of processes that are taking place, whether we're talking about psychedelic, mystical, or paranormal experiences. That they have similar kinds of effects on individuals, sort of like changing their, you know, what Jeffrey Kripal calls the flip. These experiences transform people in some way. And then also in the kinds of characteristics of experiences and the phenomenology of experiences, there are lots and lots of very interesting overlaps. And the one that I focused on a lot in the book that will be coming out later in the year is, what Rudolf Otto called the numinous, this idea of a religious experience being both terrifying and kind of wonderful at the same time. And this feeling response seems to echo through all sorts of different kinds of extraordinary experiences, right from mystical experiences through to magic mushroom experiences and seeing a ghost or something in your bedroom. So I think, yeah, there are connections here. Not saying that it's necessarily, don't want to be simplistic about it, but there are connections, yes.
Thank you. One very last. Do you find that academia is becoming more open to this type of conversations and research, or is it still relatively difficult to be taken seriously at face value as a rigorous study?
I think in certain areas, it is becoming more acceptable to talk about these things and to discuss them seriously. If you went into a physics laboratory or something and tried to talk to someone about your extraordinary experience, then you might, they might show you the door. If you go into an anthropology department, then you might have a different experience. So yeah, there are pockets within the academy of safe spaces to talk about these things, but there's also the other stuff that's going on around it, and there is still there is still a taboo around it as well. And there are people, some individuals, some organizations as well, that really don't like people to talk about it. So there's potential for a backlash.
I like to think about noseologies as one of the places in which we can do that and try to do that. So I take the opportunity to wrap up. I think it's time now. Thank you, Professor Hunter, for your participation and wonderful conversation. And thank you for having been with us and for the question you asked. Please stay tuned on the activities of the CSWR, the Transcendence and Transformation Initiative, and of noseologies, obviously. You can find all this information on the CSWR website, including the registration link for our next Noseologies event that will be next week. I will have a conversation with Dr. Amy Hale, another fellow ethnographer, on ways of knowing through the changing landscapes of esoteric art. We will talk about esoteric art as a way of knowing, women artists, and feminism. But if you want to follow Dr. Hunter's work further, you can participate to this event that you can find in the chat. Thank you all for having been with us, and I wish you all a great rest of the day. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Sponsor, Center for the Study of World Religions.
Copyright 2022, the President and Fellows of Harvard College.